It was just a typical day when she noticed the frail woman struggling to carry her grocery bags. The weight of age and the burden of life had clearly caught up with her, and without hesitation, she stepped in to help. What she didn't know then was that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change her life forever. The elderly woman, who looked like just another senior citizen in need of a little assistance, had a secret so powerful it could alter the course of her future in unimaginable ways. As she helped the woman into her car and chatted about mundane things, she never once suspected that she was talking to a billionaire. She was merely focused on the kindness of the moment, but the elderly woman was studying her, taking in every word, every gesture. Little did she know she had just caught the attention of someone whose world was ruled by wealth, influence, and an unfulfilled wish. That wish? To see her executive son find a woman worthy of his heart. And this young woman, with her generous spirit, had unknowingly ticked all the boxes. But here's the twist. This wasn't just a simple matchmaking game. No, the stakes were much higher. What started as a random act of kindness was about to entangle her in a world of secrets, wealth, and manipulation. The billionaire, fascinated by her sincerity, would stop at nothing to make her marry her son. And her son? He had no idea his mother was orchestrating such a bold plan. What lengths would the young woman go to when she realizes the full weight of the situation? Would she be able to navigate the manipulative forces at play without losing herself in the process? But there's more. As she gets drawn into the billionaire's world, the choices she makes will soon begin to test her in ways she never imagined. Could love truly blossom in a situation like this? Or would the very wealth that seems to promise her everything slowly begin to take everything from her? The story is only just beginning. The days after their encounter passed in a blur. She couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman from her mind the way she had looked at her with that mysterious gaze, as if seeing through her, as if weighing something more than just a simple favor. The conversation had been lighthearted, and yet there was something about the way the woman had thanked her that lingered, a tone in her voice that hinted at secrets she wasn't yet ready to share. It was as if she knew something about her future, something about what was to come. But she couldn't afford to think too much about it. Life went on. She returned to her normal routine, taking care of her responsibilities, balancing her part-time job with volunteering at the local shelter. That's where she met new people, felt like she was making a difference, but also where she started to feel the weight of something else creeping in. There were whispers, even among her friends, about a strange woman who had been asking about her. At first, she thought little of it, but as the days passed, the questions grew more frequent. Had she met the woman? What did she talk about? There was a sense of urgency in the way people spoke about her, a strange curiosity that made her nervous. One afternoon, as she walked out of the shelter after her shift, she was greeted by an unexpected visitor, a young man well-dressed, with an air of authority that immediately made her feel out of place. He introduced himself as the elderly woman's son, though his demeanor was more aloof than the warmth she had expected. He seemed to know more about her than she was comfortable with. His questions casual, yet pointed. It took her a moment to realize that this wasn't just a friendly son inquiring about his mother's recent interactions. He was sizing her up, just like his mother had. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "But she's been talking about you. I'm curious what made you help her?" His words felt like an interrogation disguised as curiosity, and for the first time, she felt that something was off. She hadn't even realized that the elderly woman had been talking about her at all, let alone to her son. But before she could form a response, he smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach. His eyes. "I'm just interested in what kind of person my mother seems to have taken a liking to," he said, as if it were a casual remark. But his gaze was sharp, focused. He was looking for something he wasn't going to find just by asking questions. The conversation ended quickly after that, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random check-in. There was something more at play, something far more calculated. She hadn't realized it yet, but the moment she helped that woman, her life had already become part of a larger game, one where she didn't know the rules, and the stakes were far higher than she could have imagined. Over the following weeks, things began to spiral in ways she couldn't explain. Invitations to exclusive events, unexpected gifts arriving at her, expensive jewelry, fine wines, and letters from the woman's son. He made it clear that he was interested in her, but it felt wrong, like something was being forced upon her without her consent. She hadn't asked for any of this, and yet she couldn't seem to get away from it. One evening, she received a call from the elderly woman. Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying tension to it. "I think we need to talk," the woman said. "I'm sure you've been wondering why my son has been in touch." She wasn't wrong. The thought of him had crossed her mind more than once. But what was she supposed to say? How could she explain the strange pull she felt, the mixture of attraction and unease whenever he was around? "He's not just interested in you because of your kindness," the woman continued, her tone growing more serious. "He's looking for someone to marry, someone he can trust, someone who isn't blinded by money or status." There was a pause on the line, the silence heavy with unspoken truths. "And that someone is you." The words hit her like a cold wave. She didn't know how to react, couldn't process the weight of what the woman was suggesting. Marry her son? She hardly knew him, and the more she thought about it, the less she was sure that she wanted to. But the idea of rejecting the woman, of walking away from everything she was offering, was terrifying. What if she was wrong? What if this opportunity, this strange twist of fate, was something she couldn't pass up? But that's when the true scope of the situation began to reveal itself. The woman wasn't just asking her to marry her son. She was making it clear that her son's future, his career, and even his happiness were tied to her acceptance. She was being swept into a world of power and wealth that, until now, had only existed in her dreams. But at what cost? As the days passed, the pressure intensified. The woman's son continued his subtle pursuit, charming, manipulative, but never revealing too much. He had been raised in a world where everything was calculated, where relationships were forged for reasons beyond love, and he expected nothing less from her. But she wasn't sure she could play the game the way he wanted. She was used to her simple life, her quiet moments, and the thought of losing herself in a world of luxury felt like drowning. But the stakes weren't just about her. The more she learned about the family, the more she realized there was something darker at play. The woman's influence stretched far beyond her son, and there were people who would stop at nothing to ensure the match happened. She couldn't understand why it mattered so much. She wasn't some trophy, some pawn in their chess game. She had a life, her own dreams, her own desires. And yet, despite all of her resistance, she found herself inching closer to a decision that would change everything. Should she walk away, risking losing everything the woman had promised? Or should she step into a world where love was secondary to ambition and her own? Heart became a bargaining chip in a much larger game? But then, just as she was beginning to gather the strength to make her decision, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman invited her to a private dinner, just the two of them. As she arrived, she was greeted not by the familiar warmth of the woman's presence, but by a cold, calculated gaze. Something in the room had shifted. "I've been watching you," the woman said, her voice low and deliberate. "You don't understand yet, do you? This is bigger than just a marriage. It's about your future, about our legacy. I'm giving you the chance to secure a place in this world, a place that many would kill for. Don't turn it down." The weight of those words settled heavily on her chest. She couldn't back out now, not without losing everything. But as the dinner ended and she left the mansion that night, the uncertainty in her heart grew. Was this a blessing or a trap? The question lingered in the air, unresolved, as the tension between desire and fear continued to build. The path ahead wasn't clear, but the choices she would soon face would define not just her future, but the very person she was becoming. And in the shadows, the game was far from over. The days after the dinner felt like a blur. She could no longer shake the heavy weight of the decision that loomed before her. The elderly woman's words haunted her, echoing in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. "This is bigger than just a marriage." The phrase repeated over and over, making her question everything she thought she knew about herself and the life she wanted to lead. Despite her best efforts to remain detached, she found herself constantly thinking about the consequences of her choices. The luxury that had been offered to her was undeniable. The power, the influence, the chance to escape. The daily grind and step into a world where her every need was catered to. It was a dream come true for many, but for her, it felt like a gilded cage. She didn't want to be trapped in a world where love was an afterthought and power reigned supreme. But could she afford to walk away? Each time she tried to push the thoughts aside, she found herself drawn back into the whirlwind of the woman's world. Her son, ever the charming enigma, had continued his pursuit, his gestures of affection growing more frequent, more intense. Yet every time they spoke, she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, her every word measured. She had started to wonder if he truly saw her as a person, or if she was just another pawn in his mother's plan. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found herself standing at the threshold of a decision she couldn't avoid any longer. She had been invited to yet another dinner, this time with both the elderly woman and her son. She knew that tonight, the conversation would be different. It was no longer about simple pleasantries or casual conversation. It was about her future with them or without them. As she walked into the grand dining room, the tension in the air was palpable. The woman, sitting at the head of the table, smiled at her warmly, but there was a hardness in her eyes that unsettled her. Her son sat beside her, a quiet presence that seemed to loom over the room. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence alone spoke volumes. "You've had time to think," the elderly woman said, breaking the silence. "I can see it in your eyes." The doubt, the hesitation. She paused, as if waiting for the young woman to speak, but she remained silent, unsure of how to answer. I understand why you're reluctant, the woman continued, her voice softer. Now, but you need to understand the bigger picture. My son's future depends on this union. Our legacy, our influence, it all rests on the choices you make. The words stung, but they also struck a chord within her. She had known all along that this wasn't just about her and her feelings. It was about something much larger. The question was whether she could swallow her discomfort and step into this world, whether she could accept the price of power, or if she would continue fighting for the life she thought she wanted. Her son finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that made her stomach twist. You don't have to decide tonight, he said, his gaze locked on hers. But you will have to decide. Eventually. You can't live in the shadows forever. The words hit her like a punch. He was right. She couldn't keep playing this game of uncertainty. She couldn't continue to dance around the edges of a world she wasn't sure she belonged in. The moment had arrived, and there was no more avoiding the truth. In the days that followed, she found herself isolated in her thoughts. She spent hours walking through the quiet streets, replaying every moment in her mind. What was she really after? Was it love, security, power, or something else entirely? She had always dreamed of a different life, a simpler life, one where her choices were her own. But now, with the weight of the woman's offer pressing down on her, she wasn't so sure anymore. Then, one night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized something. The woman and her son weren't just offering her a life of wealth and status. They were offering her control, the kind of control she had never known. It wasn't just about marriage. It was about shaping her own destiny. The realization struck her with the force of a revelation. The life she had imagined for herself was not the life she was going to have. She had already been thrust into a world far beyond her. Old reality, a world where every decision would have repercussions. And with that understanding, she made her choice. It wasn't a decision that came easily, nor was it one made with a light heart. But she knew she couldn't continue to live in limbo. She had to embrace the world they were offering her, or walk away completely. She couldn't keep dangling on the edge, afraid to dive in. She called the elderly woman the next morning, her voice when it came through. The phone was steady, resolved. I've made my decision, she said, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying at the same time. I'll marry your son, but on my terms. There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, she thought she might have said something wrong, something that would make the woman change her mind. But then the woman's voice came through, thick with approval. Good, she said. I knew you would see reason. You won't regret it. But as the conversation ended, she couldn't help but wonder what on her terms really meant. Could she truly maintain control, or had she already lost it? And what would the future look like, now that she had crossed the point of no return? The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind. The mansion was buzzing with activity, preparations for the grand event taking shape. Her future husband, though quiet and reserved, seemed content with her decision, though his eyes held a trace of something she couldn't quite place, something that suggested he wasn't entirely happy either. He hadn't fought for her, hadn't even asked for her affection. It was if this was simply another business deal to him, another arrangement that would further his goals. But as the wedding day approached, she began to see a different side of him. Late one night, as she sat alone in the garden, he came to her, his face more open than she had ever seen it. "I know this wasn't your dream," he said, his voice soft. "But I want you to know, I don't take this lightly. I never asked for this, but I do want you to be happy, whatever that means." For the first time, she saw him not as a figure of power, but as a person, someone who, like her, was caught in a world that demanded too much from him. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all. The wedding was beautiful, as grand as she had imagined, with guests from all corners of the world in attendance. But as she stood at the altar, staring into the eyes of the man she was about to marry, something inside her clicked. This wasn't just about wealth or legacy. It was about building something new, something that could be her own, even in the midst of everything she had given up. And in that moment, she made a vow to herself. She would not lose herself in this world. She would take control, find a way to carve out her own space within it. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would never stop fighting for her place in it. The wedding ended, and life moved forward, but the journey was far from over. As she walked hand in hand with her new husband, she realized that every choice, every decision had led her to this point, and from here on out, her story would be hers to write.